He wrote her name on the envelope as a joke. Callum Voss, founder of Voss Capital, the most feared venture predator in Chicago, was 3 glasses of Macallan 18 into a bitter Thursday night when he scrawled it on the last gala invitation and sealed it before anyone on his staff could stop him. The woman whose world he had demolished 2 years ago without ever learning her face. He thought it was funny. He thought she wouldn't come. She came. 800 guests. $40 million in jewelry. A dress code enforced like scripture. And then the gilded doors of the Meridian Grand opened, and Nadia Solis walked in wearing a midnight black gown that didn't ask anyone's permission. And the room didn't pause, it recalibrated. Callum found her in 12 seconds. Not because she was beautiful, though she was, with the quiet and precise beauty of someone who has never needed a room's approval. He found her because she was the only person among 800 who was not looking at him. She was looking through him. Nadia Solis was a forensic financial analyst from El Paso, Texas, and the daughter of a woman who had lost everything to Voss Capital 2 years before. 43 families destroyed, hers among. She had spent 2 years turning herself into a precision instrument, credentialing, studying, mapping the architecture of Calem's empire from the outside, and when the invitation arrived at her P.O. box like a divine accident, she didn't hesitate for a single second. While Callum Voss raised his champagne glass across the ballroom thinking he had sent a joke, she had already memorized every line of his company's balance sheet. What nobody in that ballroom knew, not Nadia, not Callum's associates, not the financial journalists disguised as guests, is that Callum Voss had also spent 2 years waiting. Not for her specifically, for someone with enough reason to finish what he could not do alone. The question that will keep you here is this. If he knew who she was from the beginning, why did he never say a word? Chicago has the kind of winter that doesn't apologize. The wind comes down off Lake Michigan with the precision of a judicial sentence, cuts through the coat, passes through the skin, and settles into the bone with a coldness that lasts until April. It was this city hard, pragmatic, built by people who learned not to complain about the weather that Callum Voss had chosen as the headquarters of his entire life. Not because he loved it, because it suited him. The envelope was written at 11:42 on a Thursday night, in the 40th floor office of Voss Tower, with a half-empty bottle of Macallan 18 and a list of names his assistants had prepared for the annual gala. Callum had crossed out 37 names with a single diagonal line of his pen. One blank line remained at the bottom of the list, left a space for a last-minute addition. He wrote a name on that line. Not because that person deserved an invitation, because the idea of watching her walk through those gilded doors into the middle of his world, surrounded by his people, and the expression on his associates' faces when they realized who she was, that amused him. It was the kind of elegant cruelty that Callum practiced with the ease of someone who had learned that power permeates. He signed the envelope with the same hand he used to sign acquisition contracts, the same deliberate handwriting, the same absence of remorse. The next morning, when he was sober enough to have canceled the delivery, the envelope had already left the building. Nadia Solis found it in the P.O. box of an office she rented for $200 a month in a commercial building in El Paso, where she kept a mailing address for anything she didn't want associated with her apartment. She was carrying coffee and 3 months of bank statements when she picked up the envelope. Ivory, gold foil, embossing. The kind of paper that costs more per sheet than she spent on lunch. She stared at it for 14 seconds, then opened it carefully, the way you disarm something. She read the invitation once. Then again, she set the coffee on the desk, sat down in the second-hand chair she had bought 18 months ago, and looked out the window at the parking lot outside for a stretch of time she would afterward be unable to calculate. Then she picked up her phone and started making reservations. She was not the woman Callum Voss had imagined when he wrote that name. He had imagined someone defeated, possibly bitter, certainly out of her element in a room like that. Someone who would cause a delicious discomfort among the other guests, a dissonant note in a perfectly tuned concert. What he had failed to calculate, because he had never bothered to truly investigate the people he destroyed, was that Nadia Solis had used the 2 years since the collapse of her mother's firm to become precisely the kind of person who can walk into a room like the Meridian Grand and make the room not herself, feel inadequate. The firm had been called Soulless Associates. Small, solid, 32 years of operation in El Paso, specializing in wealth management for working-class families, the kind of business that exists not to enrich its founders, but to ensure that ordinary people do not lose the little they have managed to accumulate. Elena Solis, Nadia's mother, had built that company with the quiet determination of someone who understands that financial dignity is a form of freedom. For 3 decades, she had protected 43 El Paso families from the kind of predators who circulate at the edges of the financial market. Then Voss Capital arrived. The acquisition was fast, surgical, and devastating. An intermediary fund bought the client portfolio of Soulless Associates using instruments that Elena had no technical capacity to decipher on her own. And by the time she hired a lawyer, it was too late to reverse the transfers. The 43 families were dispersed to new managers who didn't know their names, their stories, their fears. Elena Solis lost not just the business, but the network of trust she had built over a lifetime. She continued living in the same El Paso house she could barely afford to keep, and Nadia, who at the time was in her 2nd year of a master's program in finance at the University of Texas, temporarily abandoned her thesis and came home to be with her. She came home. And then, instead of simply staying, she stayed differently. She stayed and armed herself. 2 years of surgical study, certification in forensic financial analysis, evening courses in corporate law. She learned to read acquisition contracts the way a pathologist learns to read tissue, looking for the exact origin of the damage. She mapped the structure of Voss Capital, its intermediary funds, its acquisition path, its documented victims. She built a dossier, and then she waited for a point of entry. The invitation was the point of entry. The night of the gala was a Friday in November, with the kind of cold that makes city lights appear sharper than they should. The Meridian Grand Ballroom sat in the Loop. In that stretch of the city where the buildings are old enough to carry a kind of architectural arrogance, as if they know they have outlasted governments and are still standing. Nadia arrived by cab, because she had calculated that arriving by private car in a room like that would require a kind of performance she wasn't interested in putting on. She arrived as someone who already belongs. The dress was black, architecturally cut. The kind of piece that doesn't need ornamentation because the structure itself is the statement. She had spent 3 weeks finding exactly that dress, because she knew that the first impression in an environment like this is a form of argument. She didn't want to look rich, because that would be a lie easily detected. She didn't want to look plain, because no one respects someone who voluntarily diminishes them. She wanted to look like someone who doesn't need to make any of those calculations. And that is exponentially harder to pull off than anything else. She managed it. When the doors of the Meridian opened and Nadia Solis walked in, there was a particular movement in the room that people like `ElenaVoss learned to read over years of frequenting environments exactly like this one. A collective adjustment, a recalibration. It wasn't the kind of pause that happens when someone enters dramatically, when someone wants to be seen. It was the kind of pause that happens when someone enters and the room doesn't immediately know how to categorize her. And that uncertainty, in a ballroom full of people accustomed to categorizing everything in seconds, was enough to make 800 people hesitate for half a second. `ElenaVoss was on the other side of the room, speaking with an Illinois senator and the CFO of a Boston insurance company. When he felt the hesitation, he had this radar, developed by the necessity of surviving in environments where social information is currency, and when he felt it, he discreetly redirected his line of sight without interrupting the conversation. It took him 12 seconds to find her, and then he kept looking, because she was the only person in the room who was not looking at him. That, for `ElenaVoss, was completely not out of vanity, though the vanity certainly existed, but because in 20 years of financial operations, of galas and acquisition dinners and board meetings and conferences where he was invariably the most powerful figure in the room, people looked at him. It was a law of the environment. Whoever holds power is the gravitational, and others, consciously or unconsciously, orient themselves in relation to him. But this woman, in a black dress he couldn't immediately identify by brand and therefore couldn't immediately price, was standing near one of the appetizer tables with a glass of still water, watching the room with the calm attention of someone who had come to do a job. He didn't recognize. He didn't know her name, didn't know her face. He knew only the name he had scrawled on that drunken envelope. And now, for the first time, he considered that the joke might have escaped his control in ways he didn't yet fully understand. He excused himself from the senator and the CFO and walked toward her with the particular cadence of a man accustomed to environments that move in accordance with his direction. People subtly shifted as Callum moved, not out of fear exactly, but out of the perception that something inevitable was being decided by the path he chose. He reached her before she had finished the glass of water, and when he positioned himself in her line of sight, she raised her eyes with the composure of someone who had already calculated exactly this. "You're the only person in this room who didn't look at me when I walked in." It was not an especially original opening, and he knew it. It was a test. "I know," she said. She didn't smile. She didn't apologize. She set the glass on the table with the kind of precision that comes from someone accustomed to measuring their own gestures. "Callum Voss." He extended his hand. "I know that too," she said, and shook it. "Nadia Solis." He was quiet for 2 seconds, processing the name, the face, the composure. The fact that she was here, in this ballroom, because of an invitation he had sent as a cruel joke, and that she had accepted it with a seriousness that now unsettled him in a new way, a way he didn't have an immediate name for. "You came," he said, and there was in his voice a quality his associates would have recognized, as caution disguised as indifference. "You invited me! Or did you not expect me to take it seriously?" There was a moment then. In that room of 800 people and $40 million in jewelry and the soft weight of a chamber orchestra in the background, when Callum Voss felt something he rarely felt in professional environments, the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. It was a strange feeling, not unpleasant, which was stranger still. They stayed together for 45 minutes on that first night. They talked about the Chicago financial market with a precision of two professionals who know exactly where the lines are and where they choose to cross them. Nadia asked questions that no one with her supposed background should have known how to ask. Technical questions, surgical questions, questions that presupposed an intimate familiarity with the internal structure of acquisition funds. Callum answered with the caution of someone who is being studied and knows it, but can't quite identify the exact angle of the investigation. At the end of the evening, when the other guests had dispersed into smaller groups for the private bars on the upper floors, Callum Voss did something that he afterward, reconstructing the sequence of events, couldn't adequately explain even to himself. He offered her a consulting position at Voss Capital. The offer was genuine in one half and territorial in the other. Genuine because he had recognized in her, over 45 minutes, a level of analytical competence rare enough to be valuable. Territorial because there was something in this woman that he felt instinctively needed to be kept within his field of vision. Things he couldn't see clearly enough always unsettled him more than things that threatened him openly. Nadia looked at him for 3 seconds, then said, "Yes." It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't surprise. It was the response of someone who has just watched a door they plan to open from the outside swing open from within, and who is disciplined enough not to show what that means. She accepted not out of flattery, out of access. The first 2 weeks at Voss Capital were, for Nadia, an exercise in near physical She settled into a consultant's office on the 38th floor, 2 floors below Callum's war room. With access to financial databases she had spent months trying to reach through external channels. Now, they were available with a password that Callum's assistant had provided on the first morning with the bureaucratic naturalness of someone handing over a pen. She worked with the discipline of someone on a mission, which is precisely what she was, but with the additional care of someone who knows that any misstep in rhythm can compromise everything. She mapped during the day, on the company's computers, the acquisition patterns of Voss Capital. At night, in the Wicker Park apartment she had rented for 3 months, she processed what she had found and cross-referenced it with the dossier she had built over the previous 2 years. She was looking for the exact moment of the decision, the document, the signature, The board vote that had authorized the destruction of Soulless Associates? What she found instead unsettled her. The documentary trails of Voss Capital were impeccable, where they should be impeccable. And there were gaps where there shouldn't be gaps. She found references to authorizations that didn't appear in the standard files, signatures on documents that had been subsequently replaced by revised versions, and a pattern of communication between the company's legal team and an external law firm in New Orleans that didn't appear in any official report. It was like searching for the mark of a fire and finding, instead, the mark of someone who had tried to put one out. She didn't immediately understand what that meant, but she recorded every detail with the precision of someone trained not to interpret before she has sufficient data. Callum, in those first weeks, maintained with her a distance that was professional on the surface and something else entirely underneath. He appeared at morning briefings with the kind of attention his other consultants had learned to identify as a sign that something or someone had awakened his genuine interest. He asked questions about her work that were technically relevant but subtly personal. How she had learned forensic analysis, where she had studied corporate law, what had drawn her to the field of acquisition of dating. Nadia answered with half-truths that were as technically precise as they were strategic. It was a kind of dance, and both of them knew they were dancing, but neither of them yet knew what the music was. The trip to Savannah came in the fourth week. Callum was acquiring a historic maritime logistics company, founded in the 19th century, with shipping contracts along the eastern seaboard that represented a considerable asset. He brought a team of 6, and Nadia was among them because she had produced, in the preceding weeks, an analysis of the company's debt structure that Callum had read twice and annotated in the margins, which his assistants knew was the equivalent of an enthusiastic compliment. Savannah has the quality of a city that decided not to hurt. The streets are shaded by oaks with hanging moss that falls like curtains. The squares follow each other with a regularity that is almost a philosophical argument about the value of pausing. And the air carries a humidity that clings to fabric and continuously reminds you that you are somewhere different. For Nadia, who had spent the last 2 years in the controlled aridity of El Paso and the industrial cold of Chicago, Savannah felt like walking into a room where someone had forgotten to keep the defenses in place. She watched Callum work for 3 days, saw him in a negotiation room with the heirs of the maritime company, 3 brothers older than him and infinitely more tired, and watched the way he dismantled their resistance, not by force, as she had expected, by precision. He identified, in each person across the table, the exact point of tension, the thing they most feared losing, and built the negotiation so that the alternative to selling was always worse than the sale itself. It wasn't cruelty. It was a very cold and very clear understanding of how fear works as a lever. On the second night, after the team had dispersed to their rooms, Nadia went to the hotel lobby bar because she couldn't sleep. Callum was already there, with a glass of bourbon and a tablet full of spreadsheets, which was his version of relaxation. They stayed for 2 hours talking about the maritime company, then about the logistics market in general, and then, in a transition that neither of them planned, about their parents. Callum spoke about his with the brevity of someone who has spent years training himself to compress a large wound into the minimum number of words. His father had built a financial conglomerate in Pittsburgh in the 80s. It went bankrupt when Callum was 17. Not from incompetence, but from the combination of excessive leverage and a recession that arrived 3 months earlier than the models had indicated. Callum had watched, from the bedroom on the upper floor, the disintegration of an empire that had defined his entire identity until that point. "You've spent the last 20 years making sure that never happens again," said Nadia. It wasn't a question. Callum turned the glass slowly in his hand. "That's a reasonable theory. It's what the numbers show. Every acquisition Voss Capital makes is structured to eliminate uncontrollable variables. You don't buy growth. You buy stability." He looked at her for a moment, with that attention she had learned to recognize as his state of maximum. "Are you analyzing me or the company?" "Both. You can't understand one without the other." There was something in the Savannah air that night, in the distant murmur of the bar emptying, in the heat that persisted even past midnight, that made it harder to keep the edges where they were supposed to be. Nadia felt it. And she felt, which was more disturbing, that Callum felt it too. That there was between them a current of understanding that had nothing to do with the work, nothing to do with their respective purposes in that hotel in that city. And that was precisely the kind of thing she had promised herself she would not allow to happen. She said goodnight before the conversation found the point of no return. He didn't stop her, but he watched her leave, and she knew he was watching. And neither of them spoke of it the next day. It was also in Savannah that she made the mistake she would only understand weeks later. In an unguarded moment, during a technical conversation about maritime logistics in the Gulf of Mexico, she mentioned the port of El Paso with a specific geographic familiarity. The familiarity of someone who knows not just the port but the land access routes, the surrounding communities, the names of the neighborhoods nearby. It was the kind of detail that only exists in the speech of someone who grew up near that place. Callum said nothing. He filed it mentally with the precision of someone trained to catalog what people reveal when they're not paying attention. And he said nothing. Back in Chicago, the weeks that followed were an escalation that both of them recognized and neither of them named. The tension between them had changed in quality. It was no longer merely the intellectual friction of two well-matched adversaries. There was something physical in it, something that existed in the way Callum positioned himself in a room relative to, in the way she chose where to sit, in meetings based on where he already was, in the moments of silence between paragraphs of financial analysis that lasted a second longer than necessary. She was losing ground. She knew it. She kept working on the dossier, kept accumulating data, but there was a part of her that had begun to see Callum Voss not as the architect of a destruction, but as a man who had built around himself a fortress of control so he would never have to feel what he had felt at 17, in a Pittsburgh hallway while watching his father sign bankruptcy papers. She understood that, and the understanding made her vulnerable in a way that was not in the plan. What she didn't know, in those weeks, was that Callum Voss had quietly asked Desmond Precht, his head of security, to run background checks on all the external consultants hired in the past quarter. It was routine due diligence that Precht executed religiously, and which, in the case of Nadia Solis, had produced a file that Precht placed on Callum's desk one Tuesday morning without comment. Because he had learned over 7 years of working together that Callum preferred to receive information without emotional context, Callum read the file. Her mother's name, the firm's name, the date of the acquisition, the connection between Solis Associates and Voss Capital. He read it twice, then closed the folder and looked out the 40th floor window at the lake, which that day was a heavy, motionless gray, like molten metal before it cooled. He didn't summon Nadia, didn't request a meeting with Liga, didn't change his tone in the following day's interactions. What he did instead was promote her. He gave her access to the strategic acquisition file for the next 18 months. He opened for her the folders containing the company's most sensitive documents, and he waited to see what she would do with it. Because Callum Voss had learned, at 17, and never forgotten, that the only way to understand what someone truly wants is to give that person exactly what they came looking for, and watch what they do when they find it. Nadia found the files open, and felt, for the first time since she had walked into that building, that something was wrong. Not with what she was finding, with the ease with which she was finding it. New Orleans exists in opposition to Chicago, the way heat exists in opposition to cold. Not merely as a difference in temperature, but as a different philosophy about what is possible in a body and in a city. Chicago is vertical, metallic, organized by the necessity of resistance. New Orleans is horizontal, humid, built on the belief that beauty justifies risk. They arrived in November, which in New Orleans still carries the residue of summer in the air, and Nadia felt the city as a physical warning. Defenses cost more here. The acquisition dinner was scheduled at a restaurant in the warehouse district, in a 19th century brick building that had once been a storage warehouse and now served lobster and natural wine to people who made 8-figure deals with the same casualness others used to order takeout. The company in question was a port infrastructure group with contracts along the Mississippi, and Callum had brought a smaller team that himself, Nadia, CFO Marcus Thiel, and senior attorney Reed Okafor. It was a sign of trust that Nadia had registered and analyzed but not yet fully Desmond Precht had not traveled with them, which Nadia later learned was deliberate. The dinner ran with the fluency of a well-rehearsed operation. Callum was exactly what she had learned to expect from him: precise, attentive, capable of letting silences work for him. The representatives of the Port Group, to middle-aged partners from Baton Rouge, with the tired reserve of men who have negotiated many times and lost more than they like to admit, began the evening resisting and ended it asking questions about the post-acquisition integration process, which is the unmistakable signal that a negotiation is concluded in the mind of the seller, even when the contracts haven't yet been signed. After the group's representatives left, Marcus and Reed went to the upstairs bar to celebrate with the kind of scotch the company paid for. Callum and Nadia remained at the table with the remnants of dinner and a half-finished bottle of wine. And it was then that he said, with the absolute serenity of someone who had planned this moment, "You know that Desmond investigated, don't you?" She didn't let anything change in her face. Every external consultant goes through routine background verification. Yes. But not every external consultant has Solis associates in their family history. The silence that followed had weight. It was the kind of silence that exists when two people who have been making surgical feints around each other finally stop and face each other directly. And neither is yet certain where the other has placed their hand. "When did you know?" she asked. Her voice was completely controlled, which cost more than anything else had cost her in those 3 weeks ago, he said. "But I had suspected before that. In Savannah, the El Paso port. You spoke about it the way someone speaks who grew up on the outside of it, not from inside market analyses." Nadia set the wine glass on the table with care. "And you promoted me. I gave you access. For what?" Callum Voss leaned slightly forward, elbows on the century-old wooden table, and looked at her with the expression of someone about to lay down cards from a game that had gone on too long. "For you to find what I needed someone to find. But before we continue, I need you to tell me what you've already found." There was in his question a quality Nadia had not anticipated. It was not an interrogation. It was an invitation. And that distinction, small as it was, shifted something in the structure of the conversation that she was still trying to map when she began to speak. She told him what she had found: the inconsistent authorization patterns, the signatures on documents that had been subsequently replaced, the communication with a New Orleans law firm. She spoke with the precision of a technical report, without emotional inflection, because she had learned that emotional inflection was a vulnerability she could not afford at a moment like this. Callum listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for 15 seconds, then said, "The signature on the authorization documents for the Solis Associates acquisition is mine. But I didn't sign it." She looked at him. "That's what anyone would say." "I know. Which is why I've spent 80 months building proof that I didn't." What followed was one of the longest conversations Nadia had had since she arrived in Chicago. They stayed at that table until the restaurant began turning off the lights in the other sections, leaving only the pool of light above them as if the space understood that something was happening there that required privacy. Callum told her about Harlan Voss, his father, the man who had built and lost a conglomerate in Pittsburgh, and who had spent the decades since operating at the margins of the financial world, using the Voss name as currency without the institutional legitimacy of the company. Callum had rebuilt from zero. Harlan had forged his son's signature on at least 6 transactions over 4 years, using the prestige of the Voss Capital name as cover for operations that Callum had never approved and which, in 2 documented cases, had caused severe damage to small companies. Solis Associates had been one of those operations. Callum had discovered the fraud 18 months after the El Paso collapse, when an internal auditor found a discrepancy in the signature dates that didn't align with Callum's travel calendar. He had spent the 18 months since then quietly building a legal case, without involving authorities yet, because Harlan Voss was positioning himself for a federal financial advisory appointment in Washington. And Callum knew that if he exposed his father before the case was complete, Harlan would have the legal resources to bury the evidence. "You needed someone with enough personal motivation to do the forensic work that your internal team couldn't do without creating a visible paper trail," said Nadia. And there was in her voice a quality that wasn't exactly anger, but was its close relative. Yes, said Callum, without apology, without ornament. The word alone, which was, she recognized, his most honest form of speech. You used my personal motivation as a tool. I used your invitation as a starting point. What you built after that was entirely yours. A pause. And it's better than anything my team would have produced. Because you weren't just looking for evidence. You understood what was lost. There was something in that statement that Nadia needed a moment to process. Not because the logic was difficult, because there is a distinction between being instrumentalized and being recognized. And she had not expected to face both in the same sentence from the same person. At that table in New Orleans, with the smell of candle wax and old wood in the air, she didn't answer immediately. She looked at the wine glass she had stopped drinking from an hour ago. Then she looked at Callum Voss, at that face she had spent 6 weeks learning to read, and said, "Show me the complete file. What you've built in 18 months, tomorrow morning." And there was in his answer the precision of someone who had planned exactly this scene, but who was now, for the first time in a long time, slightly uncertain about what it meant to him personally, beyond everything it meant operationally. The file Callum presented the next morning in the hotel room. He had turned into a temporary office with the compulsive efficiency that Nadia had learned to recognize as one of his forms of managed anxiety was exactly what he had described. 18 months of careful forensic documentation, built at the margins of Voss Capital's resources in a way that neither compromised the company nor alerted Harlan. Nadia spent 4 hours reading. Callum worked on his own spreadsheets across the table, and the two existed in the same space in silence, with the ease of people who have discovered they can think in each other's presence, which is rare and not accidental. What she read was simultaneously the confirmation of everything she had suspected and the complete refutation of the conclusion she had drawn. The forged signatures were documented with forensic expertise in handwriting analysis. The financial movements connecting Harlan Voss to the operations were traced with sufficient clarity to support a federal investigation. The pattern of fraud extended across 6 states and at least 12 companies beyond Soleus Associates. And there were names, dates, and amounts that made the narrative uncontestable for any investigator with adequate access. Callum Voss had not destroyed her family. His father had used his name to do it. Nadia sat with that information for a stretch of time. She would afterward be unable to measure precisely. It was one of those revelations the brain processes in layers, not all at once. First, the factual information, then the implications, then what the implications mean for everything that came before. 2 years of preparation, organized around a wrong conclusion. Not entirely wrong because Harlan Voss was real, the fraud was real, the damage was real. But the origin was in the wrong place. The target was in the wrong place. "Why didn't you go directly to my mother?" she asked eventually. "You had enough evidence to at least explain what had happened." Callum stopped writing. "Because she would have taken the case public before I had the complete file, and Harlan would have isolated the evidence. I needed time to ensure the case was unassailable before any exposure." A pause. "And because I didn't know how to explain that, I had spent 18 months working on a case related to her family without it looking exactly like what it wasn't." Which was what? A damage control maneuver. A brand protection strategy. He looked at her directly. It wasn't that Nadia had to decide whether to believe him. She had not found, in 6 weeks of intensive observation of Callum Voss, the kind of lie that serves the ego at the expense of reality. What she had found was a man who lied when convening in business, who manipulated the environment when necessary, but who had a particular relationship with the truth when confronted directly. He told it, even when the truth damaged him. She believed, and the act of believing was the most complicated thing she had done since she walked into the Meridian Grand, in the black dress with the dossier in her hand. "You said you needed someone with enough personal motivation to finish what you couldn't do alone," she said. "What happens now that I know what I know?" "Washington," said Callum. "Harlan is about to be appointed to a federal financial advisory position. The confirmation hearing is in 3 weeks. If we're going to take this somewhere, it's now." There was in the phrase, "if we're going to," a grammar that neither of them addressed directly, but that both of them heard. Nadia looked at the open file on the table, at the names of the 43 El Paso families listed in one of the annexes, at her mother's name on one of the first pages, Elena, rendered with the dry precision of a legal document that doesn't know and doesn't care what it means to the person it belongs to. "Give me 2 days," she said. "For what?" "To independently verify the file. Not because I don't believe you." A pause. "Because I need to believe it for myself." Callum nodded. And there was, in his nod, a respect she felt, as something physical, like a temperature changing slightly in a room. She spent 2 days verifying. She used the contacts she had built over the previous 2 years, legal consultants in Dallas and Houston, whom she paid for hours of independent analysis without explaining the full context. What they returned confirmed what Callum's file stated, with the addition of one detail that Callum had left out, possibly because it involved a personal decision that implicated him emotionally. At 2 points during the preceding 18 months, Callum had had the opportunity to present partial evidence against Harlan. In civil proceedings that would have been sufficient to cause significant reputational damage to his father. He had chosen not to on both occasions, waiting for a complete. She sat with that information. A man who could have hurt his father with imperfect tools and chose instead to wait for better ones. Not out of filial compassion. She didn't believe there was much compassion in the relationship between Callum and Harlan Voss. But for the same reason, he did everything. Out of the necessity that things be done in a way that could not be undone. It was a kind of perfectionism she recognized, that she had practiced over the last 2 years with the same determination and the same cost. On the afternoon of the second day, she called her mother in El Paso, not to tell her what she had discovered, not yet. To hear Elena Soli's voice and remember why she had come to Chicago in the first place. Why she had put on the black dress and walked through those doors and stood in that ballroom without looking at Callum Voss while he found her in his field of vision. Her mother asked how the work was going. She said fine. Asked if she was eating right. Said she was. The conversation lasted 7 minutes and was completely ordinary. And Nadia had to end the call before her voice broke, because she had realized, listening to her mother talk about the neighbor's new dog and the rising price of coffee at the grocery store, that what was at stake was not abstract. It had never been abstract. She called Callum. "I'll go to Washington," she said. A 2-second pause. "Okay, but on equal terms, not as your consultant, as a partner in presenting the evidence." Another pause. Then, yes. She hung up the phone and stood for a moment in the hotel room with the silence of New Orleans outside, the distant sound of music from a bar 3 blocks away, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she was moving towards something instead of moving towards someone. It was a small distinction, but it was the difference between revenge and justice, and she had waited long enough to know that those two things are not always the same. Washington, D.C. in November has the specific coldness of a city built to be permanent, and which therefore doesn't apologize for the cold. The mall is long and gray at that time of year, the trees bare, the monuments lit against the dusk with the solemnity of things built to last beyond those who built them. Nadia and Callum arrived on a Monday, 2 days before Harlan Voss's Senate confirmation hearing, and checked into separate hotels because there was between them, at that point, a clarity about what was about to happen that required each of them to arrive at it autonomously. They met Tuesday morning in a rented office in Georgetown, neutral ground that neither of them had chosen for sentimental reasons. The file was complete. Nadia had added to it, in the preceding weeks, the pieces that were missing to make the case not merely convincing but unassailable. A forensic handwriting analysis she had commissioned from an independent laboratory in Chicago. The documentation of the 12 parallel cases beyond Soli's associates, and a timeline that made any alternative interpretation of Harlan's involvement impossible to sustain. Callum had prepared the presentation strategy. Not to the public, not yet. First, to a Senate subcommittee, through a contact of Rito Kafurs who had access to the office of the Financial Committee chairman. It was the slowest path, and the most solid one. It was Callum's choice, and Nadia agreed with it, not because it was the strategy she would have chosen alone, but because she had learned, over 6 weeks of watching Callum Voss work, that he knew the difference between what looks decisive and what actually decides. They spent Tuesday afternoon in the Georgetown office, preparing the presentation. It was detail work, the kind of preparation that has nothing dramatic about it, verifying each document, numbering each annex, building a narrative that was both factually impeccable and humanly comprehensible to legislators, who are not specialists in corporate financial fraud, but who need to understand what is at stake clearly enough to act. At one point in the afternoon, as Nadia was reviewing the annex containing the names of the affected families, she stopped. Callum was across the table and saw her stop, and stayed quiet because he had learned, over the past 2 months, to distinguish her silences. This was the kind that asks for space, not intervention. She looked at her mother's name for a while, then turned the page and kept working. At 6 in the evening, the presentation was ready. Callum stacked the documents with a methodical precision that was his way of ritualizing the end of a long process. Then he looked at Nadia with that attention she had spent 2 months learning not to deflect, and said, "When I sent that invitation, I didn't know who you were. I know that. When I found out, I should have told you immediately. Yes, I didn't tell you because I needed you to continue." A pause. "That was wrong of me. Not strategically, personally." Nadia looked at him. It was rare to hear Callum Voss make the distinction between what was strategically correct and what was personally wrong, because there had been, in the 2 years she had studied his company and the 2 months she had worked inside it, the impression that for him those two categories were frequently the same. That he had built around himself a system in which personal decisions were always also which is another way of saying that he rarely allowed himself the cost of a decision that was only human. "Are you asking for forgiveness?" she asked. "No," he said. "I don't have that right. What I did isn't the kind that forgiveness resolves." He held her gaze. "But I wanted you to know that I understand the difference." There was in that statement, in its particular lack of ornament, something that Nadia felt arrive in a place she had kept closed with considerable effort, considerable amount. It wasn't absolution. It was precisely the opposite. It was someone refusing absolution because they understood that some things should not be absolved, only acknowledged. She looked at him for a moment, then said, "Tomorrow," and began gathering the documents. The subcommittee hearing took place on a Wednesday morning, in a room in the Hart Senate office building with the kind of lighting that makes everyone look slightly older than they are and slightly more tired than they should be. Harlan Voss was seated at the main table with 2 attorneys and the satisfied air of someone who had arrived at this moment after decades of maneuvering and was finally about to harvest the result. He didn't know his son was in the building. Callum and Nadia waited outside during the first portion of the hearing, in a waiting room with beige leather chairs and a legislative aide who brought them coffee without asking if they wanted it. The subcommittee chairman had been informed, through Reed's contact, of the nature of the material to be presented, and had guaranteed 30 minutes of private session after the initial testimony. Nadia drank the coffee without tasting it. Callum didn't drink his. They sat in silence side by side, and in that silence there was a quality different from all their previous silences. It was the kind that exists immediately before something that cannot be undone. "How are you?" she asked. Callum was quiet for a second. "I'm not entirely sure." And there was in the honesty of the answer, in its refusal to provide an edited version of what he felt, something she recognized as the best version of what he was. "He's your father. He's the man who forged my signature on documents that destroyed 12 companies and 43 families using my name." A pause. "Those two things don't cancel each other out." "No, they don't." And there was nothing more to say about it, because it was simply, and truths of the kind that have no resolution don't need commentary. They only need someone willing to sit with them. When the aide came for them, they walked into the room, side by side. Harlan Voss saw them enter, and there was a movement across his face that passed through many things in less than a surprise, calculation, and then something that Nadia, who had spent 2 years studying the faces of people at the moment they understand, they've been exposed, recognized as the specific expression of someone who understands that the game is over, but doesn't yet know how they'll fall. Callum didn't look at his father. He set the file on the table in front of the subcommittee chairman and said, with the particular stillness of a man who had waited 18 months for exactly this moment, "You came here to destroy me. I've been waiting for someone with enough reason to finish what I couldn't do alone. He said it to Nadia, not to the subcommittee chairman, not to Harlan, to her. And then he turned to the table and began to present. It took 42 minutes. The subcommittee chairman listened in silence, interrupting only twice to ask technical questions that indicated he was understanding the material with the necessary depth. Harlan's attorneys attempted to intervene at 2 points. The chairman silenced them with the brevity of someone who understands that there is no technical argument capable of responding to what is being presented. Harlan said nothing during the 42 minutes. He looked at the documents in front of him with the expression of someone calculating possibilities and arriving, one by one, at the conclusion that none remained. The confirmation hearing was suspended that afternoon. A Senate investigation was opened within 48 hours. The story broke first in Chicago, in the Tribune, then in the Journal, then on national channels with the particular velocity of stories that combine money, family power, and the documented destruction of ordinary lives. Which is exactly the kind of narrative that the financial public and the general public can understand simultaneously. Harlan Voss was not appointed to the federal position. As a result of that, and the volume of evidence that the Senate investigation began uncovering in the weeks that followed, he faced multiple civil actions and an ongoing criminal investigation that did not return what had been lost. But it made it impossible for him to continue using the Voss name. Callum learned of the criminal investigation from a phone call he received in the middle of the night, from a number he didn't recognize but answered anyway, and the voice on the other end was his father's, who said only, "You should have left me alone." Callum was silent for 2 seconds, then said, "No," and hung up. He stayed awake the rest of that night in the Washington hotel room, not because he was disturbed, but because there was inside him a kind of silence that was new. The silence of a space that had been occupied by a particular tension for 18 years, and that was now empty. And empty is different from resolved, but it is a beginning. Nadia went back to El Paso 10 days later. Not because the work in Washington was finished, it wasn't, but because she had reached the point where the work that remained was work for lawyers and investigators, and she had spent 2 years preparing to be the person who builds the case, not the person. She had done what she came. The question now was what to do. Had discovered in the process. Her mother didn't know the details yet. She knew Nadia had been working on a case connected to Voss Capital, because Nadia had said so carefully in the preceding weeks, preparing the ground. But she didn't know about the file, didn't know about Harlan, didn't know about the distinction between the man whose name had destroyed Soli's associates and the man who had spent 18 months trying to document the damage. Nadia arrived in El Paso on a Thursday afternoon with a small bag and the complete dossier in a folder she wasn't going to open that day. First, she needed to see the house. First, she needed to see her mother. Elena Solis was in the kitchen when Nadia arrived, making coffee with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done that exact thing for decades and therefore does it without thinking, which frees the mind for other things. She looked at her daughter, and her face did the thing that only mothers' faces do. Immediately recognize that something has changed, without yet knowing what, and calibrate the response accordingly. They sat, Nadia told her. Not all at once, with the rhythm of someone who understands that information needs space to land before it can be processed. Elena listened. At one point she cried briefly and without drama, the kind of cry that is more a release of pressure than a collapse, and then kept listening. When Nadia finished, Elena was quiet for a time, then said, "And the son, Callum?" He knew what his father had done. He found out 80 months after the fact, and spent the 18 months since building a case. Elena looked at the table, at the coffee cup, at her hands around the cup. "That doesn't give back what we lost," she said. "No," said Nadia. "But it's different from having done nothing. It's very different." Elena nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the acknowledgement of a distinction that mattered. Those two things are not the same. And Elena Solis was precise enough to know. Callum came to El Paso 3 days later. It had not been exactly arranged, but it had been implied in a conversation he and Nadia had in Washington. On the afternoon after the hearing, when she had said she needed to go back, and he had been quiet for a moment and then asked if there was anything he could do. And she had answered only, "I don't know yet." Don't know yet is the kind of answer that carries within it a promise that the question is not closed. Callum had understood that, because he had spent 2 months learning to read Nadia Solis with the attention she deserved. He arrived by a rental car from the airport. No security, no assistant, none of the apparatus that surrounded him in every other context in which she had seen him. It was a version of him that was simultaneously smaller and larger. Smaller in scale, larger in willingness to be seen without armor. Elena Solis received him at the door with the sobriety of a woman who had built 30 years of professional relationships on the ability to distinguish between what people say and what they are. She looked at him for a few seconds, then said, "Come in," with the tone of someone making a statement, not extending an invitation, which was a distinction that Callum noticed, and which made him want to be worthy of it. They sat in the kitchen. Elena served coffee. Callum accepted it, in the cup with the slightly cracked handle that was evidently the everyday cup, and didn't ask for another, and didn't look at the cup with the kind of discomfort that people accustomed to a certain level of finished display when confronted with the marks of ordinary use. He held the cup carefully, and drank the coffee, and sat in silence while Elena talked. She talked for 15 minutes. She described what had been lost, not just the business, but the clients she had known for 30 years. The families who had entrusted her with the savings of a lifetime, the sense of purpose that comes from being a person who does work that matters for real people. She described what it was like to wake up one day and understand that it had ended, not because she had failed, but because someone had decided that the value of what she built could be converted into something else. Without asking her permission, Callum listened to all of it. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain. He didn't redirect the conversation to what he had done to try to correct the damage, because he knew, with the particular intelligence of someone who has learned why that kind of redirection exists, that there are moments when what a person needs is to be heard without anyone simultaneously trying to fix or contextualize what they're saying. When Elena finished, there was a silence. Callum set the cup on the table. "I know, I can't give back what was taken," he said. "I can't. And I'm not going to pretend that the legal process underway undoes what your family went through." A pause. "But I want you to know that the name on those documents was not placed there with my knowledge, and that when I discovered what had been done using that name, I didn't stop." Elena looked at him for a time, then said, "I know you didn't stop. My daughter spent 2 months studying you. She doesn't fool easily." There was in the comment, in its particular combination of assessment and conclusion, something that was different from absolution, but that acknowledged the complexity in a way that few moments in those 2 years had managed to do. Callum stayed in the kitchen for 2 hours. Nadia was mostly silent the whole time, watching the and there was in this scene, in the cracked cup and the simple coffee and the man in a suit who had arrived from the airport without a driver, to sit in a chair that cost less than any object in his office and stay with the weight of what his name had cost. Something she had not planned to find when she had bought the ticket to Chicago. There was a man who was trying, with the only tools he possessed, which were the tools of power and structure and documentation, to do the thing that power rarely attempts, to be accountable in a way that cannot be reversed later. That didn't make the 43 families whole, didn't make her mother whole. Some losses are permanent, and the story Nadia had lived through over the past 2 years had been, among other things, a long education in the permanence of certain damage and the insufficiency of any response to it. But there was a difference between damage that is ignored and damage that is witnessed, between a crime that is erased and a crime that is documented, between the person who causes destruction and walks forward and the person who, upon discovering that their name was used to cause destruction, stops and stays, and builds a case over 18 months in a silence that brings them no obvious benefit, only the weight of knowing they are doing the right thing in the only language they know. She had not planned to find that distinction, but she had. Callum left in late afternoon, when the El Paso light had that golden, oblique quality that November in the desert carries, the kind of light that makes everything look simultaneously very sharp and very far away. Elena went inside when the car turned the corner. Nadia stayed in the doorway. She had spent 2 years building around herself an architecture of purpose that had no room for detour. It had been necessary, that architecture. It had been what kept her moving when movement was hard. But every architecture built for a specific purpose needs. When that purpose resolves, to be re-evaluated because the walls that protect also isolate. And what had functioned as a fortress for 2 years had begun to feel, in recent weeks, like a kind of prison she had built herself and to which she held the key. Her phone vibrated. It was a message from Callum. Flight was cancelled. Was a hotel in the city that looks reasonable. I can try again tomorrow if that works. There was in the message the specific quality of a question that doesn't allow itself to be asked directly, which she recognized as Callum's version of vulnerability. Asking without asking. Because asking directly means being available for a no that he wasn't yet sure he could receive. She held the phone for a moment. The golden November light. The quiet street. Her mother's kitchen with the cracked cup and the coffee that had been served to a man who had arrived without a driver and without security to sit with the weight of what his name had cost. She wrote back, "There's a restaurant 2 blocks from here that serves the best pozole in the city. If you haven't eaten..." The reply came in 30 seconds. "I haven't eaten." She got her keys and went out. They ate pozole at a formica table with paper napkins in a restaurant that had photos of saints on the wall and a television showing soccer on mute. Callum ate with the honest appetite of someone who hadn't eaten properly in days, and who wasn't pretending indifference to the food in order to seem sophisticated. Nadia ate slowly and watched him and thought that there were very few people in the world capable of sitting at a formica table after a day like the one they'd had and simply existing in it without trying to turn it into something else. They talked about the case, about what would come in the following weeks with the Senate investigation, about the attorney who had been retained to represent the affected families in a civil reparation but something. They talked about Chicago and what would happen now with Voss Capital, which was undergoing an internal audit that Callum had voluntarily initiated to ensure that any other operations with contamination from Harlan's history were identified and addressed. And then, when the restaurant had emptied, and they were the only ones at the table, and the television had changed to a cooking program, they talked about other things. Things that had nothing to do with files or proceedings or the weight of 2 years of preparation and 6 weeks of infiltration and 42 minutes in a Senate hearing room. Callum talked about Pittsburgh. Not the condensed version he had given in Savannah, but the complete version. The upstairs hallway. 17 years old. Watching his father's signed bankruptcy papers with a hand that trembled slightly, but a voice that didn't tremble at any moment. The way Callum had learned, from that day forward, that the voice must not tremble, because the voice that doesn't tremble is what separates disaster from total collapse. And the way that lesson had become a cage he had inhabited for 20 years while calling it protection. Nadia listened. Then she talked about her mother. Not the dossier version, not the forensic. The version of coming home to El Paso on a Saturday afternoon and finding Elena Solis in the kitchen making coffee as if everything were normal. Because Elena Solis was the kind of woman who makes coffee even when the world is falling. Because while you're making coffee, you're still standing. And how Nadia had understood in that moment that there are 2 ways to respond to loss. Fall with it, or turn it into fuel. And how she had chosen the second option without realizing she was also, in the process, becoming someone who didn't know how to rest. It was nearly midnight when they left the restaurant. The street was cool, the kind of November cool in the desert that arrives suddenly after the heat of the day, and the stars were visible in a way they aren't in Chicago, where the city's light erases them. They walked to the front of the restaurant and stood for a moment on the sidewalk. There was between them in that moment the temperature of 2 people who have spent 2 hours being honest about difficult things, and who are now standing face to face with what that honesty leaves in the space between. "I'm not sure what this is," said Callum. He was looking at the street, not at her. It was the kind of statement that requires avoiding eye contact. "Neither am I," she said. "But I know I don't want to act as if it's nothing, in order to avoid finding out what it is." Nadia looked at the stars for a moment, then at him. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me outside a professional context. I'm trying to be a different person from the one I was trained to be." "I know. I can see it." And in that statement, I can see it. So simple and so completely different from forgiveness or from promise. There was something that had cost more than anything else to arrive at. Not a declaration about the future, but the acknowledgement that the present, this specific present, with the sidewalk and the cool air and the stars and the two of them facing each other after everything was worth being recognized as real. She went back to her mother's house. He went to the hotel the next morning, before he caught the flight that this time wasn't canceled. She met him in front of the hotel with 2 coffees from the same restaurant where they had eaten. He took the coffee. They stood there for 20 minutes in the El Paso morning cool, without making grand declarations, without establishing parameters or expectations or any of the things people do when they're afraid that what exists between them is too fragile to bear the weight of being. When the taxi arrived, Callum held the door open for a second. "I'll be in Chicago next week," he said. "If you come, there are still things in the file that need analysis." It was a sentence that carried inside it another sentence that neither of them needed to say out loud. "Maybe," she said. He nodded, got in the taxi. She stood on the sidewalk with the coffee in her hand until the car turned the corner and then stood a little longer, not out of melancholy, but for the specific pleasure of being present in a moment without already being in the next one. Days later, Nadia was sitting in her mother's kitchen with a coffee and the document folder open on the table when Elena came in, saw the folder, saw her daughter, and sat down across from her without saying anything. They stayed like that for a while. The two of them, with the El Paso morning light coming through the window, and the neighbor's dog barking in the distance, and the coffee cooling in the cups, with the patience of things that have waited long enough to know that hurry doesn't help. "Are you going back to Chicago?" asked Elena eventually. Nadia looked at the folder, at the coffee, at her hands around the coffee. "Probably because of the work." "Partly." Elena picked up her cup and drank. "He's complicated." "Very. So are you." Nadia looked at her mother. There was on Elena Solis's face, at that moment, the specific expression of a woman who has lost a great deal and learned, from that loss, to distinguish between what has value and what merely appears to, and who therefore doesn't waste energy on judgments that aren't necessary. "I know," said Nadia. "Too complicated," said Elena. "The kind of thing that either explodes or actually works, with nothing in between." "I know that too. And you're going anyway." It wasn't a question. It was an observation from a mother who had watched her daughter grow up, had watched her come back, had watched her arm herself and leave, and return different in the way that only happens when a journey changes the person making it in ways they had not planned to be. "Yes," said Nadia. "I'm going anyway." Elena nodded. She picked up the folder and began reading the documents with the methodical attention of someone who had built 30 years of business on the ability to read what is on the page without letting what is on the page read her. And Nadia looked at her mother and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that was not purpose, and was not mission, and was not the tension of a loaded weapon. But that was quieter, and more solid, and more like what existed before all of this began. It was simply being present, with her mother, in the kitchen, with the coffee, with the clarity of someone who walked toward one thing, and arrived at something entirely different, and who discovered, in the process, that the different thing was what was needed all along. The last scene that matters happened 2 months later, on a Saturday in January, when `ElenaVoss came to El Paso for the second time. This time without a professional pretext, without a file in his bag, without a prepared strategy. He came because Nadia had said she would be there that weekend, and he had calculated that Chicago to El Paso was less than 3 hours by plane, which is reasonable for any reason that is honest enough. They went to the same restaurant, Pozole again, because Callum had specifically requested it, which Nadia noted as the kind of small detail that says more about a person than any financial analysis. Afterward, they went back to Elena's house, which received them with the cracked cup and the simple coffee and the silence of a woman who had processed a great deal in recent months and had arrived at a peace with all of it, not resignation, but the kind of acceptance that happens when a person understands that life owes the living no particular, only the continuation of moving forward. The three of them stayed in the kitchen. The conversation was about small things. The neighbor's dog who had finally stopped barking at cars, the unusual cold that had arrived in El Paso that January, a restaurant Elena had been meaning to try. Things that carried none of the weight of files or Senate hearings or 2 years of preparation for a confrontation that didn't. had ended differently from how it had been planned. At one point, Callum was washing the cups at the sink because he had offered, and Elena had accepted without ceremony, and Nadia was sitting at the table watching him. Watching this man who had written a name on a drunken envelope and inadvertently set in motion a sequence of events that had culminated in this kitchen, in this cracked cup, in this conversation about the neighbor's dog, which is exactly the kind of ending neither of them would have predicted if they had tried to predict anything. He was complicated. There were things between them that were not resolved and that might never be. Because some things don't resolve, you simply inhabit them. There was the past of the Voss name and what that name had cost, and there was no way to erase that cost. Only to acknowledge it and go forward anyway, which is different from pretending it doesn't exist. There was also, and this was new for her, a willingness to go forward anyway. Callum dried his hands on the dish towel and turned around. He found her eyes. There was on his face, in that moment, the expression of someone who had learned over the past months that existing without armor is possible, that it is harder than any negotiation he had ever conducted. But that what remains after the armor comes off is more real than anything he had ever built. Nadia watched him cross her mother's kitchen in the weak January light, with the cracked cup and the dish rack and everything that existed between them, the file and the hearing in Savannah and New Orleans, and the cruel joke in an ivory envelope that had been the beginning of all of it and said what there was to say. You were never the joke. I just didn't know the punchline. And in that sentence, so simple and so completely different from everything she had planned to say when she had bought the ticket to Chicago 2 months before, there was everything that needed to be said. Not a clean beginning, because clean beginnings don't exist for people who arrived from where these two arrived, but a real one, which was, in the end, the only thing worth having.